From theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Stephen and Suzanne Weiss Dean of Weill Cornell Medicine and Provost for Medical Affairs of Cornell University. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City. I'm here at the American College of Cardiology meetings in New Orleans, and I always use the opportunity while I'm at the meetings to catch up with friends and colleagues to talk about some of the issues that affect all of us in cardiovascular medicine. The topic for today is one that is handled very differently depending upon who you talk to, and that is misinformation and how misinformation is affecting public health, individual patient health. It covers a lot of ground, and I thought it would be worthwhile to really meet and talk with somebody, a good friend, who is really putting himself out there to try to have the public discourse, but doing it in a way that I think is constructive and that can offer some lessons for all of us. So I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Rob Califf. Rob is an instructor in medicine at Duke. He used to be an endowed professor at Duke, but I guess his absences in Washington meant that they brought him back at the instructor level. Rob certainly is known to this audience. He's a two-time commissioner of the FDA. He has held a variety of academic leadership jobs, has held a variety of technology company related jobs. And so I think he's a perfect person to help bring this conversation all together. So Rob, thanks for joining us on theheart.org and Medscape Cardiology.
Great to be here.
Let's go sort of the big picture, and then we'll get down to some specifics, including some of the things that you're doing. Define misinformation for us in the context of what we're talking about with the public health and individual health.
It's useful, I believe, when we're studying it to divide information into information that's reliable and truthful, information that's incorrect for any reason, most often just people didn't have it right or no one really knows the answer. Then disinformation, which is information which is purposely put out there, which is known to be incorrect or pretty much proven to be incorrect, that could be harmful to people. And then malinformation, which is very purposeful, destructive information put out, often by government adversaries, as a form really of cyber warfare. And these categories are all different. The terminology itself is controversial because particularly just in the broad misinformation category, it can be argued whether a piece of information is correct or not, and often experts will disagree. So there is a lot of fuzziness there, and people can be highly offended. On the other hand, if we act like this is not happening, I think we're making a big mistake.
Well, you and I have spent our careers trying to provide clinical people with reliable information to make clinical decisions. We do that through clinical research and the generation of evidence, whether it's clinical trials, observational research to try to understand maybe the pattern of care of the way that something's being delivered. And so we've spent, in my case, it's 36 years doing this. In your case, it's a little bit longer. But we've been doing it for decades, and we've been trying to use reliable information. Now what we sometimes hear is, well, we don't need expertise. I can look stuff up on my own. Talk a little bit about how we try to parse all of that.
Well, first of all, on this issue of what we've been doing, I do feel like the methods should be the same regardless of the audience, the consumer of the information. Deriving an estimate of the truth is really a matter of gathering the evidence in a format which is structured to be able to derive an inference about causality.
There's a trigger to it.
Yeah, if you do A, will it cause B? If you give treatment A, does it reduce mortality, as an example? But there's always uncertainty in that, and I think a place where we've let people down. Yeah, and we just don't talk about it enough in the public that even, our best practice guidelines based on large clinical trials, there's still some residual uncertainty. There are issues around the boundary, and this is what the purveyors of misinformation have really seized on. And so we've now got a situation where for the average person, they're really living in an information environment which is polluted by all sorts of assaults on the idea that there is expertise. Even the head of HHS, RFK Jr., made a direct statement. Don't believe the experts, is what he said. Said that's a form of totalitarianism and religion, not science. Well, I prefer to think I'd rather have an opinion of an expert than someone who just went on a podcast And I'd really
Although
rather,
we're on a podcast now.
well, just a podcast with no other expertise. There's an example in the New England Journal from Lisa Rosenblum, who I think writes eloquently about this.
I interviewed Lisa yesterday on the topic of trust.
She has a direct quote of Mark Zuckerberg getting a patellar tendon repair, and Joe Rogan, one of the largest followings in the world, says, "Did you get your peptides?" And Mark says, "No, why would I?" And he said, "Because it helps." And Mark said, "Well, I don't know, I just asked my doctor." And Joe says, "Don't do that anymore." On the other hand, I think we've sort of led with our chin professionally because we talk to each other in an echo chamber. And when we talk to the public, we tend not to reveal the uncertainties, the vast areas where we don't have adequate knowledge. And that's being filled in by people who are selling something else, often dietary supplements, peptides, cosmetic surgery, seances, you name it.
But part of the challenge, isn't it, is that in the practice of medicine, when you're making recommendations, when you're talking to patients, I think of it as that throughout the day, clinicians are making binary decisions. Yes, no, do this, don't do that. And they're doing that based on information that they've gathered from practice guidelines, experiments, reading, et cetera. But they're also doing that based on heuristics and the pattern recognition. "Oh, I've seen 10 of these before, and this is how it's going to play out." How do you think we should be helping our, in my case, students, residents, fellows, think about the uncertainty issues? Because as you've said, I mean, you've written a couple of papers on this notion that even in a field like cardiology, where the guidelines are so evidence-driven, only about 25% of them are actually based on a very high level of evidence.
Right. And we got some examples you were just telling me about at this meeting where the trial result is in, and they're very different opinions.
This is the closure of the left atrial appendage versus a drug, an anticoagulant to prevent the risk of stroke. And yeah.
So here's what I think. A clinician with a patient in a clinic visit is a tiny part of a person's life on the other side.
Less than 1%.
Yeah. And so the real big deal is not the discussion in the clinic, although that's very important. And we've got to work on how to manage that, especially now with AI-driven heuristics, as you say. It's a whole different world of knowledge about what's accepted in the profession and what the recommendations are. The battle is occurring in real life, and people are exposed to social media and news and other forms of information 24/7. And we're over here in the clinic not engaged at all in that. But some very smart people have figured out the wellness industry is now a $6 trillion global
Is that right?
industry, yes. And it's not that we have all the answers, but if we just take what should you eat as an example, there's a lot that's known that tends to get lost in the flood of eat beef tallow and all this kind of stuff. And then people lose faith in anybody, and they tend to latch on to an individual who may be
very charismatic or telling them something that they prefer to hear.
Yeah, so don't expect an individual student or expert cardiologist to be on social media all the time trying to convince the public. I think it's more an issue of what should mainstream healthcare, medicine, biomedical professionals do to engage through their professional societies, universities, academic medical centers, to get the word out in an organized way. Because if someone is convinced, for example, that vaccines, mRNA goes into your system and it's there forever and it's dangerous, you're going to need constant reinforcement that that's not the case.
Right.
It's too complicated to get it across in one message. And so it's really, I think, an industrial effort that needs to happen. I think of it as advertising the truth. Again, with a caveat. The truth is not, we absolutely know A or B. It's, here's what we know, and here are the uncertainties about it.
For a public that's not necessarily familiar with the scientific method, where it does change, how do you begin to communicate that?
Well, we can have a long discussion about the devaluing of elementary education in the United States, because to do it right, it would have to start very early, and some societies are doing that. We both worked in Singapore as a good example. But short of that, I think we have to realize that learning is happening 24/7. I love the concept of asynchronous learning. And just like you should prepare someone for a clinic visit by things that they can do at home.
Yep.
For these kinds of things about health, what should you eat? How should you exercise? How do you control your blood pressure, your lipids, the essential aid of the American heart? Not that many things.
No.
They're just kind of boring compared to, like, I can get a peptide injection for $10,000.
90% of population attributable risk for a heart attack can be explained through life essential aid.
Yeah. And so we just need to be reinforcing that constantly. And you can't do it through a human interaction because people have lives.
You mentioned individual doctors, you mentioned institutions, terrible distrust in institutions, whether you're talking about universities or government structures, et cetera. How are we going to get ourselves organized to do this? I mean, historically, mainstream medicine is terrible at this.
I come back to advertising truth and understanding that, one of the most important things about advertising I learned in my work at Google is that the biggest thing is how often you're in front of people. And so it's got to be out there commonly, and it shouldn't be, authoritarian messages. It should be gentle messages that are preparing people to understand that science changes. There is uncertainty, but there's also such a thing as expert consensus driven by the evidence about what works. And, vaccines are a great place to start. I will note that we're not starting as far behind as I often make it sound, because if you look at the latest polling, there's a reason that a certain political party is not going to emphasize vaccines for the next few months, because people actually do trust their doctors, nurses, pharmacists more than they trust the Secretary of HHS, for example, by a large margin. So we need to take advantage of that, not to sell them something, but just to help them be educated about these issues.
What we did at Weill Cornell is we created this web series called Here's What We Know. And in a very non-judgmental way, we try to share, here's what we know about vaccines, here's what we know about other medical therapies here, and try to do it in a way that we're providing evidence in a way that's understandable.
Yeah.
But man, it's hard to compete with the bashing that comes in on that.
You know me, so I have to say a couple of things here that may, people may not like. But never forget, in a meeting with pharma execs, the person before me had just defended the oil and tobacco industry, and his first slide said, if you want to be trusted, act trustworthy. So when people say our healthcare system is spending trillions of dollars, much of it on unnecessary, expensive stuff, our executives in healthcare systems and deans of medical schools making a huge amount of money, it's kind of hard to argue with that.
Yeah,
so,
there's truth to that.
What are we actually doing, and how do we demonstrate, or how do we change? Because I would argue, one of the other things I love to talk about, every health system says it's patient-centric. Find me a person in the United States that believes their health system is patient-centric.
They believe that their individual doctor is patient-centric, or their individual nurse is patient-centric, but they don't believe that this big entity is patient-centric.
Because it's not.
Right.
It's very much driven by the bottom line, and people know that. And so we're going to have to speak up professionally to find that balance. I'm not arguing that you shouldn't make money. That's an American value, and we all need to eat, and health systems need to function. But we've lost the balance in that. I think Lisa Rosenbaum, again, has written really well about this, but we're all going to have to double down a little bit, because it doesn't help to advertise something which is not true.
Let's talk about some of the efforts you have underway. You're trying to engage young people in being some of the ambassadors out there. Is that because it's a peer-to-peer thing, or do you think that there's something about younger people as opposed to you and I that people are more likely to believe?
When I was at FDA the second time, I came in very prepared. It was the middle of the Omicron wave. I just spent 6 years at Google, and I'd been at FDA before. And it was obvious that to motivate the average person to do things that were in the interest of their health, giving them tables and charts is not a way to do it. And so we needed to be able to advertise basically on social media, but the courts actually stopped us from doing that.
Oh, I don't think I remember that. Okay.
Yes. The famous Fifth Circuit of Texas, where all these things go. The specific quote was, the FDA is not your doctor. And so I was looking at it saying, we got 100 and something communication professionals dealing with 320 to 360 million people, depending on how you count it, speaking all different languages and et cetera.
Living in urban areas, rural areas.
We need a mass of people. And so some students called me from Stanford, your old place. They had just taken the community health degree, and Kevin Shulman, one of your colleagues that we worked with at Duke, is now at Stanford. in one of his classes, they'd come up with the idea, there's 600,000 biomedical science and health professional students every year in the United States. That is a pretty sizable number.
Yeah.
They've grown up in an era of social media that we didn't, and they're pretty aware of how it works. And yet, when they're getting their educations, at least a year ago, basically they were just being treated the same as always. When they go to clinic, they learn the basics of how to deliver care, but not how to deal with what their patients were experiencing.
And how to talk to patients about that.
Right. So the idea was to pull these people together, and we're trying to form a national organization now. Not saying we know the truth, but it's through consensus and debate, looking at the evidence and social listening. What is it that people are concerned about? I'm from South Carolina. There's been a measles epidemic. There are a lot of young women with children who are concerned about school and vaccination. And we need to speak to them not as ex-commissioner of the FDA, but as peer-to-peer of other young women.
And as neighbor to neighbor and all of that, yeah.
So the idea is to really study that and understand it. And my hope is that it'll also lead to a situation where these arguments like are going on today at the ACC occur with much more feedback on what the system is understanding. Let's take a recommendation. And it may be that 55% of cardiologists think yes and 45% no. People should know that that's how it breaks down.
Right.
Maybe that'll lead to other studies that change it. Now, if it was an issue where 99% agreed, it's pretty likely that that's right.
Distilling all the evidence that that's the right thing to do. I mean, the example that I always give is that there's some things that we just know. Like if you're having a heart attack, you ought to get aspirin. And, I think 99% of us would say if you're having a heart attack, you ought to get aspirin. That's easy. But after you've had your heart attack, should you take aspirin or an ADP inhibitor? Well, then now there's a little more split on that. Rob, something that you and I have talked about a lot over the years is people's ability to think quantitatively and understand quantitative issues. Where are we with that? It strikes me that it's not so good.
I think in a way it never will be, because I really believe for some of these things, the human brain is just not configured to deal with the multiple dimensions of uncertainty. And especially now that some of the best work really is multidimensional and high-end computing. But what we can do is to really study how to break down the information into things that people can understand. And as I say, use asynchronicity to have them be able to digest it, not rushing into a clinic with 15 minutes with a doctor, but really getting that information, then coming in prepared to have the discussion from a different perspective.
So provide people the tools to be able to share with their patients about that. Let's maybe expand that in a way as we come close to the end here of this separation of public health and clinical medicine. How do we bring that back together?
Well, I think...
Or do we need to bring it back together?
I think we do need to bring it together. I think it would make a big difference if we did. It's going to be a long effort needed. I think it starts with strengthening both and making them more fit for purpose. On the public health side, from my view, the public health system has been destroyed. Not totally, but a lot of the basics, like the underpinning of SNAP for food and Medicaid for people who can't afford preventive health care, for example. We have to
Which includes
that.
2/3 of the kids with chronic diseases.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just frustrating. And we can fix it because other societies have, other high-income countries. On the sick care side, the $5 trillion in the big buildings that you preside over, which I'm part of too.
I preside over the medical school part of it, yeah.
We're spending $5 trillion. We could probably spend $4 trillion and do just as well. And then I think we need to really shore up primary care. That's where the biggest need is. Most people I know, even with money, can't get an appointment unless they hire a concierge.
Yeah. Another topic Lisa and I hit yesterday.
Yeah. And it's just no way to do things. We know the primary care system can work. And then it's integrating AI. When I know we don't have time to talk about that, but it has to be the case that the right mix of humans and AI will make a difference. But between primary care and the public health system is where people live for most of their lives. And we have to be present on that battleground, because if we're not,
somebody else will be.
They are, and they're selling things that are not useful for health and may be dangerous, like peptides.
Are you ready to have us post as part of this podcast how to get in touch with your organization, et cetera?
Yeah, that would be great. The name is Coethia. We started with Aletheia, the Greek goddess of truth, but it turns out a lot of other people have had that idea. So Coethia is meant to embody working together to seek truth.
And for the listeners, that our medical school is signed up to be engaged in this process.
And one interesting thing that happened, we started out with students, and a number of retired docs came up and talked to me as I've been giving grand rounds and things. And so we now have a platinum chapter led by Rob Califf, who's used to be the dean at University of Kansas.
At Kansas, was at Mayo before that.
So there are a lot of really intelligent healthcare professionals
who want to get engaged.
Yeah, and they're not working full time, and they have some time. So I hope they will join in.
Oh, that's fabulous. Rob, I want to thank you for joining us here on Medscape Cardiology and the Heart Dog Org. I hope that you found the conversation interesting, maybe inspiring to join in the battle against things like misinformation and how it affects not just public health, but individual health. We've had a great discussion with Rob Califf, instructor of medicine at Duke University, former FDA commissioner. And thank you for listening. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up. More importantly, if there were things you'd like us to address in the future, drop us a note. We're always looking for ideas on different shows, different topics. Let us know what you think. Thanks for joining us.